Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naimon, your host. Today's guest is Adam Levin. Adam Levin's debut novel, The Instructions, published in 2010, arrived with a lot of buzz. An inventive, experimental book of over 1,000 pages, its protagonist was Gurion ben Judah Maccabee, a 10-year-old genius from Chicago who may or may not be the Messiah. Levin's stories have appeared in Tin House, McSweeney's, and Esquire, and he was the winner of the New York Public Library's Young Lions Award and the Joyce Carol Oates Fiction Prize, among others. He lives in Chicago, where he teaches creative writing at the School of the Art Institute, and he is here today to talk about his new short story collection, Hot Pink. Welcome to Between the Covers, Adam Levin.
Hi, David.
It's good to have you here.
Thanks, man.
So, from what I've read, the Instructions took you quite a long time, nearly a decade. And
yeah.
I was curious if you were working on Hot Pink interspersed through that period of time, or has that mostly been a burst of energy since you finished the Instructions?
No, Hot Pink was it was before, during, and after. I take a lot, I think 3 or 4 of the stories were finished, are mostly finished before. I was really working on the Instructions in earnest, and then I worked on a couple during and a couple after. So it was the breaks while I was writing the Instructions were sort of few and far between those.
So did you see any cross-fertilization going on when you're writing the novel thematically with some of the things that you ended up finding interest in when you put together the story collection?
I mean, I don't know if it's cross-fertilization, because I think a lot of the times when I was working on the stories, I was thinking about different things. That was why I wanted to work on the stories. I didn't want to keep writing about this boy and this voice. Like I needed a little break. But I mean, there's some commonalities. I mean, there's a lot of romantic love stuff, and there's a lot of violence, and there's comedy. So I mean, those things are happening in both books. But I don't think thematically any more specific than that. I shouldn't say that. I mean, there's also a lot of stuff about friendship in both of them. So I think that's a little specific.
One of the things that jumped out for me as a commonality within the collection and also with the Instructions was both with Gurion and the Instructions, and here in Hot Pink, you have a lot of characters that are unusually smart, but at the same time, their braininess seems to almost be their downfall. Like they're playing out a flawed logic. Was that something you were going for? Or did you find that you found that you had that afterwards and realized that it was something you were interested in?
I wouldn't say it wasn't something I was going for directly. I think that a lot of times I'm trying to write about characters who are not conventionally thought of as being particularly intelligent, right? So you have some guy who's like a high school dropout who is studying mixed martial arts or something and parks cars for a living. And I think that there are a lot of, I don't know if there's a lot, but there are probably just as many smart dudes doing that as there are, in PhD programs. And I think that they're going to lack some knowledge that the PhD program folks have, and they're also going to have some other kinds of knowledge. But I think that generally, I like smart people of all stripes, and I think I want my narrators in most cases, maybe there's 1 or 2 exceptions, but to be, likable, to be relatable, and to get, I want them to be folks that a reader would kind of want to hang out with, maybe, and I think that when they're smarter, that's going to work better. So. So it wasn't I have to make these guys smart. It was more like I have to make them, able to articulate stuff that we don't stereotypically or normally assume these kind of folks would be able to. So.
When I was reading Hot Pink, I also wondered if at any point you'd taken a class in symbolic logic and in philosophy, because there are moments in the narrative which often are really funny moments when you pause, or the character pauses to play out a whole bunch of logical possibilities to their endpoint, almost in this sort of obsessive, autistic reverie of sorts. But and you can see maybe how their logic is flawed, though it has an internal coherency to it.
Right.
And I mean, one of the examples is I think in one of the stories you're pondering, the characters are pondering about why there are balloons on a dump truck.
Right.
Is that something?
That's
was
something
that a logical
I'm
thing?
into. I mean, well, I definitely took a symbolic logic class, just as one in college, and I really liked it. Yeah. I mean, I enjoyed it too. I forgot all the names of the proofs and everything, but it was a fun class, and I think I did okay in it. But I think that like the characters doing that. I enjoy. I mean, I don't know. I enjoy reading stuff like that, and I think that it's and what you're saying is pretty on the money. It's fun for me, and I think in a lot of ways, all of like really like fiction that I like does this like in a larger way where you take a flawed premise and like follow it to its logical extreme, and fiction's all about sort of leaving out large parts of the world in a lot of ways, and isolating maybe some ideals or something, and that's why most fiction ends sadly, because that it has to collapse. I don't know. So the characters do it a little bit more actively, I think, in my work than in some others. But I think a lot of fiction kind of does that. Like,
and I think that when you are watching the character go through this methodology, I actually think it adds to the likability and the charm of the story. One of the first things you were talking about wanting to achieve with your characters.
I appreciate that.
Well, another interesting part of Hot Pink is a lot of the characters seem to be eccentric, misfit type characters. We have the father in the opening story who wants to invent this doll that's going to help cure anorexia.
Right.
We have a story of dirty old men who are thinking back on their lives. We have the butane huffing teenagers. And then we have my favorite character is the legless lesbian genius who's a really great but unreliable narrator. And I'd read that you used to be in social work before. And I was curious as I was reading the collection if you gravitated more to I don't know if I would say characters on the margin, but unusual characters. You were saying, for instance, that you want to write smart people who aren't the typical smart people.
Right.
Is that it all come from your background in social work, do you think? Some of your interests?
Well, actually, I think there's a connection, but I think it's actually a bit reversed. I think I've always been interested in people like that, and that's maybe one of the reasons I went into social work to begin with. I always was sort of fascinated by outsiders and tended to, I don't know, befriend them and maybe generally trust them a bit more than non-outsiders,
that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then some of your use of psychology around, I think it was Skinner in Hot Pink. I wondered if that went back to some of the social work.
That certainly does. I mean, with the story you mentioned about the Susan Falls story about the legless lesbian girl, we learned about this self-perception theory. That was back in college, actually, and it always was fascinating to me. But that's not Skinner. And then the Skinner stuff, like really late, like my last trimester in when I was getting a master's in social work, I took this behaviorism class, and it was really convincing. It was and it actually painted sort of radical behaviorism in this way where I was like, this is actually quite pretty, and like sort of honors not to get cheesy, but like the existence of like a soul in a weird way that these other theories don't, by trying to describe everything else tries to describe these sort of invisible structures. Everyone knows the Freudian stuff, but not just the Freudian stuff, like id, superego, and ego, but even with like cognitive behavioral theory, like you have schema and you have automatic thoughts and you have all these things that it's just so it's sort of dehumanizing. Whereas in behaviorism, it's claims we should just basically study what we can observe, and then you kind of leave the rest in the black box that it's just going to be in. And I like that. I don't know.
You could almost imagine that as a style of writing too, just to write what you observe and allow the other stuff to be implicit in the background.
Yeah, well, I've thought about that a lot. Like, and when I write, I really do try to. I try to have characters. I don't much believe in any kind of active unconscious. So it's like I try to have characters all be motivated by things that a reader can see and be motivated by things they're aware of. Because I really think that people walk around knowing why they're motivated. I don't think they do things because something happened to them that they forgot about. I think it's they want something and they go after it, and different things in their environment trigger them at different moments to go after those things, but it's not like, there's a childhood trauma, it gets washed out because it's too traumatic, and therefore you go become a serial killer. Like I really don't believe people work like that.
In case you just tuned in, we're talking to Adam Levin, the author of the short story collection Hot Pink. Well, Adam, let's have you read a short selection from the collection so that people can hear some of the prose. If you want to introduce it, that'd be great.
Sure. I'm just going to read from the beginning of this story. It's called Finch. The narrator's he's a 12-year-old boy in Chicago, and vaguely somewhere between 1990 and now. The 53rd day in a row we hung out. Me and Franco got all these grilled cheese sandwiches at Theo's Bacon Burger Dog from Jin Woo Kim, who people call Gino because we're not in Korea or are in Chicago or people are lazy or two of those reasons. Gino's dad's son is the owner of Theo's, and summer afternoons he leaves Gino alone there. We went in at 3 when the place was the deadest, and Franco said we wanted a grilled cheese sandwich. Right as soon as Gino started making them, though, Franco told him on second thought to make that 3 sandwiches. So Gino started making a third one too. Except then what Franco said was what he'd meant was 3 apiece, and Gino stopped moving. He was over by the fryer, facing away from us, his hand on the scoop dug into the butter tub. What? Franco told him. Gino got back to work, grabbed bread and cheese from the rack on the counter. For to go, Franco said. He lit up a cigarette. I passed him an ashtray. A bunch were stacked up on the garbage cans behind us. Thanks, yo, he said. Hey, check this ashtray. Gino's dad stole. That was probably true. All the ashtrays at Theo's were Burger King ashtrays, the chintzy aluminum kind with crimped edges. And it's not like I was really that tight with Gino, but we sometimes hung out when no one else was available. And I used to have some classes with him up till last year when we started the 7th and they tracked me into gifted. So I didn't want to stand there and trash talk his dad. But you can't ignore Franco, so I had to do something. So I made a lippy face with my mouth and I shrugged. Franco shrugged back. Gino kept cooking. When the sandwiches were finished, he wax paper wrapped them, then stacked them in a bag and brought the bag to the register. He said, $13.50. Nah, said Franco. We don't have to pay today. You do, Gino said. Franco took the bag. Today it's on the house, he said. It's not, said Gino. Pay me, come on. But what could he do? Franco was 16 and Gino was my age. Plus Franco was big. Not tall, but big. And not big like me, but like muscled in a way I bet girls probably talked about. Almost like a man. His mustache wrapped around his chin and wasn't wispy. He drummed his shaved skull a few times with his fingers, which looked like, I'm thinking. Then took a frosted cookie from the cookie tree display and crushed it in his hand inside of the wrapper. He undid the wrapper and dumped out the crumbs, grabbed another cookie, and told Gino what. Fine, Gino said. There were tears in his eyes. We were ripping him off in his own dad's joint. He gave me this look. Franco flipped me the cookie. I stuck it in my pocket, mouthing the words, I'll pay you back soon. I don't know if Gino saw, but I meant what I mouthed.
And this story, Finch, was an important one for you in your career, wasn't it?
It was the first one I published, yeah.
Yeah. I know you get peppered with a lot of questions about how do you come up with these ideas? Where did this all come from? And I noticed that your response is that you really are working on the sentence level.
Yeah.
But that there are actually a couple stories in Hot Pink where the idea came first, and then you fleshed out the idea.
Yep.
Which ones were those?
Well, there's Franken Wittgenstein, which there's it's sort of like high concept type story where there's a doll that vomits that there's and originally I just had this idea. It was like I would like to write about a doll that throws up, and I don't know what it means, and I wrote this like product description, like a catalog description almost, and it wasn't very fun, as you can imagine. I mean, it was like a description of a vomiting doll. There was not much emotion to it, and I still liked the idea, and I didn't think that was good enough for it. So I started thinking about who invented the doll. And then I started thinking about who would tell about who invented the doll, and it became this sort of larger story about a family and a son who's sort of coming out of the closet, and so there's that one, and then there's another story called How to Play the Guy, which was based on this game that I don't think anyone really played, but a couple friends of mine insisted that there was a game that people played where they would go to this suburban mall in suburban Chicago, and you would walk around the mall, with a girl, and and you'd see an oncoming dude like just walking towards you, and you'd point at him and you'd go, "Is that the guy?" And like, just walk around scaring people that way. And I thought about how that game could maybe be a little bit enhanced, and how what the kind of people who would play it would actually make of it. Like, because I tend to think people do things and think that they're actually like righteous in doing what they do, like a lot of times. And I was like, how would you make this like a morally sound thing to do, or convince yourself that it were? And so I tried to write that, and that one also, I think I really wanted to write a story in the second person imperative that stayed in the second person imperative. So it does all those things. So, but those were kind of the only two that were like that. So.
Well, how to play the guy reminds me of the comment you made at the beginning about how a lot of your stories deal with friendship. And I think that is one way in which the Hot Pink collection stands out to me. We often see stories about love relationships and also parental relationships. And this one really goes into buddies and the crazy logic and sort of ecosystem of friendship.
Yeah.
And is that something that you found yourself doing? I don't want to say unconsciously because of what we were discussing earlier, but did you find that you only realized that in retrospect that was something you were interested in?
No, I mean, I think that, well, I mean, it depends what you mean, because the stories, like, they were written over like 13 years. So there was somewhere where I was writing, when I was writing the instructions, and I was in the middle of it, and actually a friend of mine had read Finch, and he was like, I like this story because it's about these two friends, and I was writing the instructions, and I was writing a lot about friendship. I mean, that book is like really heavily about sort of loyalty and friendship and what all that stuff means. And I think it wasn't so much that it was unconsciously motivated or anything like that. Is that I just have always thought about that stuff like my whole life. That's how you behave toward your friends, like what your duties are as a friend, as a family member, all that stuff. But I guess, like you said, like a lot of the other types of stories, they're covered. It's like, it's not like I don't want to read a love story or a story about some relationship with someone's parents, but it's a little bit less interesting because that stuff is more circumscribed. It's more those are roles that sort of your culture tells you what they mean in a much more clear way than it tells you what friendship means. And I think it's more open to be thought about. And I guess I always have, since I was a little kid, thought about that stuff a lot. So.
In case you just tuned in, we're talking to Adam Levin, the author of the short story collection Hot Pink. Once I took a writing workshop from the novelist Steve Almond, and he said at the end of this workshop, I want you to have a little version of me sitting on your shoulder, and I want you to hear my voice of this various advice that I've given you when you're writing. Yeah. And you actually have a parrot that sits on your shoulder sometimes when you write.
Sometimes, yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about your parrot?
He's a good guy. He's a Quaker parrot, and he's I never really had a pet, and I just, owing to a bunch of silly circumstances, I became kind of obsessed with little birds, and then I eventually wanted a parrot, which was sort of, they're really loud. Like I'm deaf to certain tones now. Like, thankfully, I think it's done. I think like the tones to which I'll be deaf are finished. They're not going to expand. I think he just killed those, that area of the eardrum. But I don't know. I got him at they have these bird shows. It sounds bad. It sounds like a dog show, but it's basically breeders come together and and you can meet these birds and. They're hand raised, and I don't know. And he's the Quakers are a really cool species because they live wild. They're from the Andes, but they live wild in Chicago and in Brooklyn. And I bet there's some out here. They're really adaptive. They build these very serious nests, and I mean, just you figure, even coming from the Andes, to be able to survive a Chicago winter. I mean, we're talking with no evolution. We're talking like birds that like escaped a pet store and figured out how to live through 60 below, and it's pretty impressive. So they're smart, and they're also they're sort of just born like cuddly. Like, it's weird. There's a couple parrot species that like being touched and held, and this is one of them. So he's nice, and he sits on my shoulder, and if I make noise, I sometimes kind of in a very autistic seeming way, I would guess, sort of read my sentences out loud to myself under my breath, and he mimics that, and so now he knows he whispers.
That's great.
Yeah.
And so, do you have any teachers' voices that you hear, echoing for you as you're looking at your own work and working on it?
Yeah, I mean, they're sort of like, they've kind of all unified into one sort of like, no, but I mean, I think I always, like, even before I had writing teachers, I sort of would have these writers who, I was constantly thinking, what would they think of this? And, it would be like, I think Salinger and David Foster Wallace and George Saunders. And then George Saunders actually became one of my teachers, and he was another one. And, so I definitely like think, there are things that Saunders, a lot of things Saunders said to me when I was his student that I think made me better faster. And I think of those things a lot when I'm working. If I get stuck somewhere, I'm sort of like, well, what would George's angle be on this? Anyone
that comes to mind at the moment?
Anyone.
Any little nugget that often reoccurs for you from him?
There's a thing where there's one thing he told me that was really, I think, just awesome, that like really stuck with me more than anything. And it was that there's a certain point, like, because I'll go into some sort of weird spaces with some of my stories, and like, and I don't ever want them to alienate a reader. Like, I really do want to be talking to a reader and feel like there's an intimate thing going on, but I want to push that to as weird a place as it can go. And I think he told me at one point that there's some moments where just like, if you need them, if you're like, this is essential, but it's going to be a bit alienating, there's a way to kind of turn to the reader and acknowledge they're being alienating. And then the reader's with you still. So it's like, and I think that was really sound advice. It's like, and I find myself like giving it to my own students sometimes, where it's like, the big example would be like in the story of Frankenwittgenstein, things get really weird, and the narrator sort of just says, like, I know this seems like a cartoon, it seemed that way to me too, that sort of
Sure.
thing, and I feel like that, like, it because you don't want the reader thinking you're trying to be like intellectually superior to them, or I don't, at least. Like, I want to just engage them as the most intelligent beings as they could possibly be, and not condescend to them. So you got to be inviting to do that, I think, and if you get a little bit uninviting for a second, they'll tolerate it, but then you got to make up for it. So I think that's one thing that really comes to mind a lot.
In case you just tuned in, you're listening to Between the Covers, and we're talking today with Adam Levin about his short story collection, Hot Pink. Did you always know, Adam, that you wanted to do more innovative, out-of-the-box fiction, and that's why you sought out George Saunders? Or was it through being with him that then you realized that's the type of writing you wanted to do?
No, actually, I think that before I worked with George, my work was actually maybe a little bit weirder. But again, it's like, I generally, like, when I got to Syracuse, when I got to school to study with him, I had this sort of dichotomy in my head that I think a lot of young writers have, where it's like there's experimental fiction and there's realist fiction. This is like a silly dichotomy I came to like pretty quick once I got to school. Is like, it's not that's not real, and it's actually like a just kind of a way to signify like what gang you're in or something. And I came to decide that whatever's going to be moving is what I want to do. And I think that in terms of like doing out of the box style stuff, or like something that's formally, innovative or different, that's not a primary concern for me. Like, I'm happy to do that stuff, but like, I want to affect people. Like, I want people to, read my stuff and have it stick with them, and have them feel like when they finished it for a reason, like it was worth it. It got better and better as it went forward. I think, yeah, I mean, when I was a kid, like, I read a lot of Kurt Vonnegut. Like, that was what I read, most, and later Salinger. And I think that with both of them, like, they get you to think sort of like, metafictionally, like, really quickly, especially if you read them when you're young. And so I end up sort of trying to actually dull out that part of myself, because like my brain automatically goes to like, this will be my metafictional solution to this problem I'm having, and that's usually a cop out for me. So I think, yeah.
I don't remember if it was the Chicago Tribune, but I think it was a Chicago paper that asked you what 5 of your favorite books were, and you mentioned Operation Shylock by Philip Roth, and I loved that you mentioned that particular book because it feels underappreciated in his work. But also you mentioned, which I think speaks to what you just said, that it's a meta book, but it's like totally accessible as a narrative.
Absolutely.
So you've got this combination of sort of formal experimentation, but you're not alienating the reader at all.
Right. It's like, it's using that stuff. And I mean, I think that's what the best formal experimentation does is it doesn't feel experimenty. It feels like this writer has figured out a way to tell a story differently that is and then executes it well. And I think Roth is like pretty much like always on pace with that. Like he uses a few flubs, but not many. And I mean, because he can get really formally weird, that guy. Like, I mean, like the Great American Novel. You ever read?
Yeah, I've read them all, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it's like that's a weird book, man. Like if you think like it's he just he's sort of a great model for that. And I actually think that his reputation as being hard to read, despite that, David Foster Wallace is like actually really accessible. Like I think some of the stories are kind of, they'll throw a wall up for you, but you take like Infinite Jest and there's this really just nice narrative in there that if you can sort of tolerate not being told it linearly, it's like, wow, this is doing all the stuff that I want fiction to do,
In the instructions, you've talked about how the your use of how you envision the reader reading and the rhythm of the reading and how you exploited that in the sense of if people need to focus really hard on an essay, then you follow it with a fight scene and you're sort of hoping that attention that's being spent to the essay is going to carry over to the fight scene that you want them to particularly pay attention to.
Right.
Did you use any of that same thought process in how to put together the Hot Pink collection and what order to put the stories?
No, it wasn't so much that. I mean, like I feel like, with stories, I don't know, I think I have different expectations for how a reader is going to handle a story than a novel. And I always think that, especially with a collection like this where there's really nothing interrelated. I mean, there's like a couple cross references, but they're just, like Ricks and Steves or something, but they're not, if they go unnoticed, I don't care. Like they're, it's just like extra stuff. Like, these are like, I really think of it as a collection of distinct stories. And the way that I think most people don't even read stories in order. I think the first thing everyone does is they go and they read the shortest story, right? They look at the table of contents and they're like, what's the shortest piece in here? And then, so it's like, I feel like I have less control as a writer over how they're going to do that. And I just try to make every story be its own thing. And the sequence I put them in, I mean, vaguely was like, I'll put like a really, an accessible story first. I'll follow it with a really weird story in case someone is going to read it in order. So I don't, screw their expectations too much. And, it's like, I'm doing this and I'm going to do this. And, but I think most people don't read it in order. I mean, very few people who do. I used to do that. I used to read them in order religiously. And now I don't. I mean, I was just like, I like the title of this one. I'm going to look at it. So, yeah.
Do you have a project that you're working on now?
I'm working on like a couple things, but I don't. They're no good to talk about at this point. I mean, one of them, I'm sort of waiting for one of them to decide to be the next thing I'm going to do because I want to write a short novel.
So in contrast to your big novel.
Yeah. I want to write a short one. I mean, I spent like I just did this piece for Playboy magazine. I did on casinos in Paris, and so that took me a while as the first nonfiction I wrote. So.
How do you like writing nonfiction?
I liked it actually. Like I did at first, I was like, ugh, I don't want to do this. But I got into a rhythm with it, and I was like, this is kind of interesting. And it was sort of like, I just because it's it was participatory, and so it's like participatory journalism kind of thing. And so, I was like, I'm not really interested in myself. And then I was like, yeah, of course. I'm like everyone else is. And so I was like, I just had to start thinking of it as though I was trying to write like a really awesome email to like someone that I liked a lot. And then it became this thing that was fun because I like writing emails to people I like a lot. So.
Well, it was great having you on Between the Covers today, Adam.
Thanks, man. It was great being here.
So we were talking today with Adam Levin, the author of the short story collection Hot Pink. This has been Between the Covers, and I'm David Naimon, your host.